These images have once again stirred the nation's conscience. Sonam Wangchuk, the engineer, education reformer and Raymond Magsaysay Award winner, sat on a hunger strike after the NEET examination controversy. His demand, the education minister must resign. On the 21st day of his fast, his health deteriorated. He was removed from the protest site and shifted to a hospital. His protest came against the backdrop of one of the biggest crises in India's education system, the NEET paper leak. Allegations of organized examination rackets, lakhs of anxious students, families spending years and fortunes preparing for a single exam, and tragically, reports of students taking their own lives after believing their dreams had been destroyed. Now, before we descend into political mudslinging over who organized the protests, who funded it, who stands behind it, or whether it is organic or not, let us instead ask two questions that actually matter. First, do hunger strikes really work in modern India? Second, even if the demand is morally understandable, is it the right demand? Because ultimately, our objective should not be winning a political argument. Our objective should be fixing India's broken education system. Question 1. Do hunger strikes really work? A hunger strike is perhaps the most powerful form of peaceful protest. It places the protester's own body at the center of political action. It appeals not to force, but to conscience. Yet history tells us something uncomfortable. Hunger strikes are morally powerful, they are not always politically effective. Take Poti Srilamulu. His fast demanding a separate Andhra state ended in his death. Massive public outrage followed. The government eventually created Andhra state. His sacrifice became one of independent India's most consequential political fasts. But now consider Professor G.D. Agarwal. The environmentalist fasted repeatedly to save the Ganga. He eventually died during one such fast in 2018. His death generated national attention, but many of the structural environmental concerns he raised remain unresolved. Then there is perhaps the most striking example of all, Irom Sharmila. She protested the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. She fasted for 16 years. She was repeatedly arrested and force-fed through a tube. She became an international symbol of powerful resistance. Yet when she finally ended her fast and entered electoral politics, she received barely 90 votes. Her own people did not vote for her. The movement faded, the law largely remained. Or consider another chapter from India's history. During the anti-Mandal Commission protests of 1990, students from the general category resorted to unimaginable forms of protest. Rajiv Goswami became the face of the movement after setting himself on fire. Several others followed. Yet despite these horrific sacrifices, the implementation of OBC reservations continued. What lesson does history teach us? The Indian state, whether governed by Congress, BJP or any other party, generally does not yield simply because someone threatens self-harm. That does not mean the protest is illegitimate. Peaceful protest is a constitutional and democratic right. But when an individual effectively says, "I will continue starving unless my demand is accepted," it becomes a blackmail. And the Indian state does not respond kindly to blackmail. Because if they concede because of one hunger strike, they create a precedent where every policy could potentially be challenged through similar methods. This is why democratic states often distinguish between respecting the right to protest and accepting every demand arising from that protest. Some compare Sonam Wangchuk's fast with Mahatma Gandhi or Bhagat Singh. That comparison deserves scrutiny. Gandhi's fasts were directed primarily against British colonial rule or aimed at preventing communal violence during an extraordinary national crisis. Bhagat Singh's famous hunger strike was undertaken inside a colonial prison against an imperial government that denied Indians equal rights. Both confronted an unelected colonial state. Today's context is different. India has a democratically elected government. Citizens may strongly disagree with its policies, they may demand accountability, they may seek resignations. But many voters may simultaneously believe that government should ultimately be judged through democratic institutions rather than by the outcomes of individual hunger strikes that hold the government ransom. There is another reason why large-scale public mobilization through fasting has become more difficult: the Anna Hazare movement. In 2011, millions of Indians united against corruption. People from every social background joined the agitation. There was enormous goodwill. But what did that eventually lead to? Anna Hazare gradually faded from the political center stage, while new political actors such as Arvind Kejriwal emerged as its principal beneficiaries. Whether one views those developments positively or negatively, the experience left many citizens more skeptical about mass movements. Today, people may agree that examination reforms are necessary. They may sympathize with Wangchuk personally. Yet, they may also hesitate before joining another nationwide agitation as they are wary of the Cockroach Janata Party and the cabal of left-wing organizations backing them. Don't trust me? Go out to the streets, a random park or a random market. Pick up 10 people randomly and ask their opinion on this. Most of them either do not know or do not support the movement. Reality is different from Instagram trends. Governments understand this political reality. Without overwhelming public mobilization, there is often little incentive for any administration to concede to symbolic political demands. But does that mean there should be no reform? This brings us to the second question. Is the demand itself the right one? Suppose Dharmendra Pradhan resigns tomorrow. What changes? The individuals accused of running the paper leak racket have already been arrested. Security for the subsequent examination was significantly strengthened. The re-examination was conducted with military-level security. The results are out, the counselling process had moved ahead. Would a minister's resignation guarantee that another paper leak never occurs? Almost certainly not. Would the next minister automatically possess a better blueprint for examination reform? Again, there is no such guarantee. This is why India should move beyond symbolic victories. The real demand should be structural reform, because the crisis is larger than one minister. It is larger than one government. It is a design failure. So hence we ask, so how do we fix India's examination system? The first reform should be administrative. India currently expects one education ministry to manage everything. Look at what the current education minister has to deliver. New education policy, private university regulation, institutions of eminence issues, UGC issues, CBSE, NEET, JEE, CUT, and other exams, ideological wars over textbook content. Ask yourself this, can Dharmendra Pradhan deliver all this? Or any one minister? Absolutely not. That is unrealistic. Separate the ministry. One cabinet minister should exclusively oversee school education and examinations. Another should handle higher education and universities. Specialization improves governance. Education deserves nothing less. Second, reform the examination model itself. The second reform is perhaps the most important of all. We need to fundamentally redesign India's examination system. Every time there is a paper leak, the official response follows a familiar script. We hear that there was a lapse, a few officials are suspended, a handful of arrests are made, an inquiry commission is constituted. The examination is reconducted and the nation moves on until the next scandal. We have to stop pretending these are isolated failures of execution, because they are not. They are the predictable output of an examination system that is brittle by design. Imagine constructing an entire bridge where the collapse of a single bolt can bring down the whole structure. You would never call it an accident. You would call it bad engineering. India's examination system suffers from the same problem. Every critical component has become a single point of failure. Take vendor selection. One of the most startling revelations during the NEET controversy was that the National Testing Agency awarded critical examination work to Eduquity at approximately rupees 171 per candidate, substantially lower than TCS's bid of around rupees 311 per candidate. The issue was not merely that one company quoted a lower price. Questions were raised because Eduquity had reportedly faced blacklisting by at least one state government in the past. Whether every allegation ultimately withstands scrutiny is for the investigators to determine, but the larger policy question remains. Should the integrity of examinations involving millions of students ever be decided primarily by who submits the cheapest bid? Public examinations are not stationary contracts or rote tenders. They are among the most sensitive national institutions. Cost efficiency matters, but reliability, security, institutional experience, and operational capability should carry far greater weight than simply being the lowest bidder. The second structural flaw is India's obsession with the single-shot national examination. For most Indian students, years of preparation culminate in one morning, one question paper, and one opportunity. If the paper leaks, millions suffer. If transportation fails, millions suffer. If there's a technical glitch, millions suffer. If there's a law and order issue, millions suffer. No resilient system should place the future of 20 lakh students on one single day. A resilient system distributes risk instead of concentrating it. The third weakness lies in the paper transport chain. Question papers travel through multiple stages before finally reaching examination centers. Every additional layer, printing presses, storage facilities, transport agencies, district coordinators, local contractors, creates another possible point of compromise. Often, the greatest vulnerability vulnerability is not the high security printing facility, but the last mile, the local transport and distribution network where oversight is weakest and accountability becomes diffused. Even if 99% of that chain is secure, organized criminal networks only need to exploit the weakest 1%. Fourth problem is rigid scheduling. India conducts examinations as if there can only be one date, one paper and one opportunity. When something goes wrong, the consequences become national. A single leak does not affect one district or one city. It disrupts counseling schedules, admission calendars, university sessions, and the futures of millions of students simultaneously. The fifth and perhaps the most worrying structural issue is the coaching economy. Families routinely spend several lakhs of rupees preparing for examinations like NEET and JEE. Various studies estimate that many households spend between 5 and 8 times India's annual per capita income over several years of preparation. Success increasingly depends not merely on intelligence or hard work, but on one's availability to afford expensive coaching, mock tests, and specialized preparation material. This is no longer simply an education system. It is an examination industry, and the examination industry has every incentive to reward pattern recognition and repetitive practice rather than genuine learning. Fortunately, India does not have to reinvent the wheel. International experience offers valuable lessons. Consider the broader American standardized testing ecosystem, which includes examinations such as the SAT, ACT, and GRE. Collectively, these tests serve millions of students every year through computer-based testing conducted across multiple testing windows. The SAT itself is offered several times annually. Instead of placing the entire future of a student on one examination day, it allows candidates multiple opportunities to improve their scores. The GRE goes even further. Candidates can take the examination throughout the year at authorized centers and in many cases under secure online proctoring from home. Institutions receive comparable scores regardless of when the test is taken, and candidates even exercise control over which scores they choose to send to universities. This model fundamentally spreads risk. A disruption on one test date inconveniences a small group of candidates rather than destabilizing an entire nation's admission process. India should gradually move in the same direction. Computer-based testing should become the norm, wherever technically feasible. Examinations should be conducted across multiple windows throughout the year. Students should be allowed multiple attempts. Admissions can then consider the best score instead of forcing candidates to stake their futures on a single 3-hour examination. Such a system would dramatically reduce the incentive for paper leaks because no single examination would determine the fate of millions. Paper setting itself also requires complete redesign. Today, examination papers are prepared by relatively small teams under intense secrecy. That secrecy, ironically, increases vulnerability because compromising one small group can compromise the entire examination. Instead, India should create enormous encrypted national question banks. Thousands of school teachers, university professors, and subject experts should continuously contribute high-quality, peer-reviewed questions. Questions should be categorized by topic, difficulty level, and learning outcomes. On examination day, secure algorithms should randomly generate papers from this vast repository according to predetermined blueprints. No individual, not even paper setters, would know the exact paper beforehand. Randomization is one of the strongest security mechanisms available in modern examination systems. Institutional reform is equally essential. Countries that consistently conduct secure national examinations rely upon stable long-term partnerships rather than constantly changing contractors. In the United States, organizations such as the Association of American Medical Colleges and Prometric have administered high-stakes medical examinations for decades. Institutional memory accumulates, security protocols mature, mistakes are analyzed and corrected over long periods. Similarly, France relies upon long-standing ministry-controlled examination systems supported by sustained public investment rather than fragmented outsourcing. India, by contrast, often reinvents administrative arrangements from one contractor to another. The recent parliamentary committee examination reforms recommended something surprisingly basic but extremely important: creating a nationwide database of blacklisted firms, organizations, and individuals involved in examination malpractice. It is remarkable that such a system does not yet comprehensively exist. More broadly, the National Testing Agency itself requires institutional strengthening. Critical functions should be increasingly performed by trusted permanent employees rather than temporary contractors. Leadership should remain stable instead of changing frequently. Every stage of the examination process should have clearly identified officers responsible for security, logistics, and oversight. And when everyone is responsible, nobody is accountable. When every link in the chain has a named officer answerable for it, accountability becomes real. Logistics also deserve far greater attention. Some countries treat national examinations almost as matters of national security. China's Gaokao imposes severe criminal consequences for organized cheating, including long-term or even lifetime disqualification from examinations. Authorities deploy extensive surveillance technology, signal jammers, biometric verification, and coordinated law enforcement to protect examination integrity. South Korea's Suneung offers another fascinating example of national commitment. On examination day, flights are rescheduled to reduce noise near testing centers, stock markets open later, police officers escort delayed students to examination centers, government agencies coordinate to ensure that logistics never becomes the reason a student's future is jeopardized. Whether India should replicate every aspect of these systems is debatable, but their underlying principle is worth adopting. A nation's most important examinations deserve military-grade planning. Finally, punishments must become both stricter and more certain. India has taken an important step through the Public Examinations Prevention of Unfair Means Act, but legislation alone is insufficient if investigation, prosecution, and conviction remain slow. Countries like France complement heavy investment in examination security with stringent legal penalties, including substantial fines and imprisonment for organized examination fraud. India should follow a similar approach. Every participant in a paper leak, from insiders to middlemen to organized criminal syndicates, must know that the certainty of punishment is high and that the consequences will be severe. Will these reforms guarantee a perfect education system overnight? Of course not. No country has eliminated examination malpractice entirely. Every system evolves through trial, error, and continuous improvement. But the objective should be progress, not perfection. Instead of repeatedly demanding symbolic political victories such as the resignation of one minister after every crisis, India should demand reforms that strengthen institutions for decades to come. The real victory will not be replacing one individual. The real victory will be building an examination system where every student believes that success depends on merit rather than manipulation. And that is a reform worth protesting for. And that is a reform worth governing for. This is Nabaarun Barooah on record.